There is an order. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. And as he said, it's really a very, very important panel, not because I'm moderating it, but because I do think that the Lawfare campaign, combined with the delegitimization campaign against the state of Israel, actually pose a real threat. And we have a very distinguished and known experts that will elaborate about it. And I hope it will be interesting. So the first one, she has the on-court advantage. Dr. Daphné Richemond-Barak is a senior researcher and the head of the Terrorism International Law desk at the ICT and the head of the International BA in the government at Reichman University. Daphne, please. Professor Gregory Rose, who actually came from Australia. Professor Rose is Professor of Law at the University of Wollongong and Director of, how are you? And the Director of Research at the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. Gregory is an expert in international law, counter-terrorism, and marine security. Advocate Natasha Hausdorff, who I know her for almost 10 years, I think something like that. Natasha is a barrister and international lawyer and director of the Center for International Rule of Law and legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Natasha is an expert in international law, national security, and the law of armed conflict. Natasha actually holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv University and previously clerked for the president of the Israeli Supreme Court. Colonel Reserve Advocate Pnina Sharvit-Baruch. Pnina is a director of the Israeli and Global Power Program at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, and former head of the IDF International Law Department. Pnina is an expert on international law, armed conflict, and security negotiation. And last but not least, of course, is Eylon Levy. Eylon is a former, I believe all of you know him. Eylon is a former spokesperson for the State of Israel, who has become one of the most globally recognized voices on behalf of Israel since October 7th. He now heads the Spokes Office, a civil society initiative advocating for Israel and the Jewish people in international media. So, we only had 42 minutes, I think. I thought 50. Okay. So, as we spoke before, we have 3 rounds, and in the first round of questions, in the first one, it will be a similar one for all of you. And as I said before, there is a clear linkage between the lawfare and the delegitimization. From my point of view, I dealt a lot with it when I was in the IDF and then in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And I do believe it poses a strategic threat to the state of Israel. And with your permission, I would like you to share your view, your perspective on those 2 phenomena, the danger, the risk they pose to the state of Israel. And just 2 examples, just to explain the linkage between them. For example, the Indra Jab Foundation, who actually its main mission in the last few months, or since the war broke out, is actually, if I may say so, to hunt Israeli soldiers all over the world. Or the declaration by Mr. Mamdani that if he will be mayor of New York, he will arrest the Prime Minister Netanyahu as a war criminal. So we see the clear linkage between those 2 phenomena. So please, Daphne, be the first one to start, and then we continue.
No problem. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Shay, and distinguished panelists. Yes, there is a clear linkage between the challenges that Israel is facing in international courts and tribunals and international political and legal institutions, and the campaign for delegitimization of Israel. These fora serve as avenues for to undermine Israel's image and Israel's brand, and I'll get back to this in a minute. But I want to go back for a second to what is going on right now in the international community and in Israel. We're facing very difficult times in Israel and abroad. And one thing we learned from October 7 is that when Israel is under attack, when Israel is vulnerable, then the Jews anywhere in the world are less safe. And so our lives changed rapidly and radically since October 7th here in Israel, but also everywhere in the world. And I think here in Israel, we tend to forget a little bit about how much has changed for Jews everywhere, from Brussels to Miami, Toronto, Melbourne, and unfortunately the list goes on. So we're deeply immersed in this war. We tend to think only about what's going on in Israel, and God bless, we have many challenges. But what's going on abroad and the reality that Jews are facing is equally important. And since we're in an academic institution here, my own home institution, Reichman University, I want to mention for a second the plight of one particular class of people, right, category of people, and these are academics that are facing attacks all the time abroad, right, and have their positions being jeopardized and put in danger because they don't want their colleagues to support Hamas, because they don't want the encampments to block the entrance to the library on campus, because they want students to feel safe everywhere. And this is in a way looking at the outcome of these campaigns, right, of what is going on right now. And so how do we approach this? Is this an issue that is only for lawyers? Is this only for, because, you know, the international legal and political fora are the avenues through which this is happening, including the United Nations, does that mean that only international lawyers have a role to play in countering it? And I think here I think there's a need to maybe change a bit the approach. And I'm glad that on this panel it's not just lawyers, because in order to take these challenges in the form that they have, you know, in how they are manifesting themselves these days, we need more than lawyers. We need communication experts. We need branding experts. We need marketing experts. We need experts in strategy like you, Shay. So we need a multidisciplinary task force to handle this battlefield. So lawyers have, of course, a role to play because they understand these legal institutions. They know when the mandates of these institutions is being distorted. They know when the Convention for Genocide is being exploited. They understand what it means for Israel to fight a genocide case before the International Court of Justice, and they can explain that. But that's not enough, and I think what we've seen deserves a more holistic approach, and we need to change a little bit, at least the way that we are handling these challenges. That will be for the beginning, and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Daphne. For my few minutes, I want to talk about the definition of lawfare. We use the term lawfare, but what does it mean? And all legal battles in courtrooms are, you know, within an idiom, are lawfare. But in the context of kinetic war, lawfare has taken on an additional meaning. It was coined first by Charles Dunlap, an American air lawyer, in 2002, and then popularized more broadly by David Kennedy, an English international law academic, and another American, Ord Kittry, came up with an additional interpretation of it. So, according to Dunlap, it is the use of legal tactics within active warfare to suppress or inhibit enemy action. He didn't ascribe to it a positive or a negative value, he simply observed it. Kennedy noted that it was now a part of rhetoric. As Daphne has pointed out, it goes beyond the courtroom, it goes into the media, into your lounge room, through the television as part of contemporary rhetoric. Ord Kittry, who's University of Arizona and also Foundation for Defense of Democracies, came up with a useful analysis, which was that it involves compliance disparity leverage. In other words, one country is going to comply, the other party, typically a non-state actor, is not. So there's a disparity in compliance between them, and it's possible for the other party to leverage that disparity to its advantage. So that would be where you have use of civilian shields, for example. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And my own addition to this is that we should ascribe a moral value to it, that it's immoral to subvert the purpose and objective of the law, effectively to subvert the rule of law, to take advantage, to take tactical advantage of this compliance disparity. So now we come to an example of how it's used. If children are put in the front of a battle line and the combatants fire from behind them, then the children are put at risk. The IDF or other combatants have the choice of aborting their operation or of immediate risk to innocent civilian children. So they're placed in the position of that dilemma. The way that you can see that this subverts the rule of law is that humanitarian law is designed to protect civilians. So by putting civilians in harm's way, the purpose of humanitarian law is subverted to the advantage of the party that disregards compliance. So it's a simple illustration. And what are the consequences of lawfare? So lawfare is a tactic. What does it actually do? It is part of the rhetoric, which means it provides disinformation. Israel targets children. It's part of the delegitimization. The state of Israel is a terrorist state targeting children. And we see today, in the context of globalization and the regulation of the global economy and interdependence, that there's a much greater role for legal rules, legal institutions, for judges, and with the creation of the International Criminal Court and the greater activism on the International Court of Justice, we find that this use of disparity in compliance and rhetoric actually has impacts on the ground. It's not just rhetoric, it's not just shmum now. It is threats to supply lines, to the supply of chemicals, of ammunition, of ability of Israeli leaders to travel abroad, and that is as a consequence of the globalization of regulation. I think I've used up my time now. One more minute. So what we see in the globalization of regulation is greater opportunity for the deployment of lawfare, working particularly, not just against Israel, but particularly against Israel, because it's an easy target. But the greater consequence is the subversion of the rule of law and the undermining of international humanitarian law particularly.
Thank you. I think this is an extremely important panel to be hosting at this conference, not least because this lawfare phenomenon has now increasingly been described as the eighth front of this war. And if Israel is going to be as successful as it has been on the 7 kinetic fronts, then a collective thought process as to how best to combat lawfare and the legitimacy issues is going to be critical and has every place at this ITC conference. I thought it might be helpful to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we got here and then what we can potentially do about it. So, circumventing somewhat the debates about definitions of lawfare, to me, lawfare is an abuse of legal processes, international legal institutions, international legal tribunals, and international law. And it's an abuse for political purposes. It is the weaponization of these institutions like the ICJ, like the ICC. And we see that, and maybe we can go into some of the examples of where the law has been subverted, the processes have been abused, the court rules are thrown out of the window, questions like jurisdiction no longer seem to count. And jurisdiction is critical because, ladies and gentlemen, it's what separates a legal institution from a purely political one. And as the discussion flows, I'm sure there'll be a lot of overlap between these political influences in the international legal arena and what law actually says. One of the reasons that this lawfare process against Israel has been so successful is because general levels of literacy on international law are not particularly high. So the next time, and I'm sure there are lots of non-lawyers in the audience, the next time someone says to you, Israel's violating international law, ask them which law. Invariably, I warrant they won't be able to tell you. And we can talk about how legal terminology is being abused in media coverage, and I'm sure Eylon will speak to that also, and how this idea of violations of international law of human rights are being used as this weapon against Israel, inverting the realities and in fact accusing the Jewish state of committing the very crimes that were committed against it. We see that in the abuse of all of these legal phrases: occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. And how this process has come about is very important. It has been decades in the making. We've already heard about legal academics being under attack. The legal academy has been taken over in a concerted fashion for many decades. And we have also seen a struggle within the international legal arena between rule of law countries like the UK, the US, Australia, Israel, and non-rule of law countries. Rule of law countries that believe that the law is a curtailment on government power, and the non-rule of law countries, the despots and dictatorships of this world, that view law as a means of wielding power. We've seen these struggles taking place in the context of negotiating international conventions. Additional Protocol 1, I think, is a key example of that. And we have seen Western liberal democracies allow themselves to be manipulated in the international legal arena by those countries that do not, in fact, view law as a curtailment on power, but view it as a means of exercising their will in the international legal arena. And they have had willing collaborators in this process. I was asked recently to debate Amnesty International in Copenhagen and in Oslo about their report accusing Israel of genocide. Now, apart from the fact that those individuals defending the report appeared not particularly to have read it, I pointed out to them the methodology section, which specified, made it very clear in black and white, that they did not have people on the ground in Gaza, that instead they relied on local government authorities for their information. So we have organizations, so-called human rights NGOs, that take information from the local government authorities in Gaza, Hamas, put it in a document which is headed up with their name, and then we see how the cyclical process begins. When UN special rapporteurs quote that document in their reports, and they subsequently get referenced in UN Human Rights Council resolutions or General Assembly resolutions, and then they may even get picked up by the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. And once that has happened, these NGOs pick up those quotes once again and say, see, the international courts and tribunals say so, and that process is then complete. This is what we need to be calling out in the international arena, in the media, and it requires non-lawyers, as has been referenced, to arm themselves with the facts and the law, and to ensure that this constant misrepresentation of what international law says cannot successfully continue. Now, I know this is an international conference, and that is important because this is not just Israel's problem. This is a fight of lawfare against Western civilization as a whole. And once these processes and these legal institutions have been subverted in this fashion, have been weaponized and politicized, they lose their credibility, they lose all real value. The ICC is not acting as a court anymore, but as a political organization. And then international law as a whole is under threat. And that means bad news for all those rule of law countries that value the international legal system that we all hoped this would still be today. So these are all really important issues to be drilling down on, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, and I agree that this is a very important panel, and I think today this is the most dangerous front that Israel is facing. So I wrote my notes so I can be precise and on time. And when we look at the legal campaign against Israel, we face a challenge that goes far beyond Israel itself. It is a challenge of living in a world that wants everything to be simple, black or white, good or bad. But reality isn't like that. Reality is messy. It is complicated. And that complexity often disappears in today's debates. So let's look at the accusations against Israel. As was said here, there are claims that are completely unfounded, sometimes so extreme they feel like modern-day blood libels. Already in October 2023, a day after the 7th of October attack, UN human rights rapporteurs already published reports accusing Israel of grave violations, not mentioning the Hamas. And ever since, the UN has continued to put out more reports with similar accusations. These reports are filled with factual mistakes and very one-sided descriptions. Yet they quickly become the basis for legal arguments made by scholars and are even relied upon by judges at the International Court of Justice and other forums. And as was already said, when international law builds on such shaky ground, it loses credibility and its ability to guide states' behavior. At the same time, and this is important, there are also claims that deserve to be taken seriously. Questions about proportionality, about how Israel balances military necessity with civilian harm, about the scope of the responsibility of Israel towards civilians in Gaza. These are exactly the kinds of questions international law is meant to address. But the problem is that they are thrown together with the extreme and unfair accusations. When in December 2023, when Israel was under massive attack from all fronts, Israel was already accused of committing genocide, any real discussion of adherence to international humanitarian law or laws of war was drowned out. This mix makes it very difficult to respond. On the international stage, Israel is attacked from every direction. Inside Israel, many people don't want to hear any legal criticism at all. The instinct is to close ranks, and the political leaders are part of the problem. They tell the public that all criticism is either anti-Semitism or support for terrorism, or at best, naive misunderstanding of our reality. But that is not true. Not every critic hates Israel. Some of them are our closest friends. And when we refuse to listen, we lose the chance to answer serious legal questions in a way that strengthens both our legitimacy and our adherence to the law. We also need to talk about the challenge inside Israeli society. This is not just about international politics. It is about us. Our soldiers are not strangers. They are our children, our brothers, our sisters, our friends. Naturally, we want to give them full support. But this makes it very hard to raise questions about how the war is being conducted. Criticism feels like betrayal. It feels like we are weakening those who protect us. And yet, if we cannot have this conversation at home, we risk losing sight of what we are fighting for. Unfortunately, this government has largely abandoned the Legitimacy Front. It acts as if legitimacy doesn't matter, but it does matter. Without it, we isolate ourselves. The threat of becoming an isolated nation is one of the most severe threats Israel faces today. An isolated nation will be poor, weak, and underdeveloped. It will be much less secure. It will also eventually surrender to anti-democratic nationalistic elements which thrive in such circumstances and lose its democratic nature and also its Jewish values as I see them. So the real challenge is this. How do we create space for ourselves inside Israel to talk openly and honestly about these issues? How do we separate the outrageous accusations, which we must reject, from the serious legal critics which we must engage with? It is not easy. It takes courage. It takes leadership. But only if we manage to do this, only if we are brave enough to confront both the lies and the hard truths, can we stay true to our values, protect our democracy, and preserve the moral ground that is Israel's greatest strength in this struggle. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to join this panel as, I think, the only non-lawyer, much to my mother's disappointment. So there are two of us. The battle for legitimacy is not the eighth front of this war, as suggested by my friend here, Natasha Hausdorff, who is otherwise correct about absolutely everything else. And I insist on calling it the October 7th War, not the Swords of Iron War. This is not an episode of Game of Thrones. I won't call it the War of Redemption either. It is the October 7th War. We must never stop reminding the world how this war started, where it started, when it started, and what we're fighting to prevent. But when we call legitimacy a front in the war, we minimize it. There are 7 physical fronts in the war. We can win on 6 of them, lose on 1 of them, and say we still won 6 out of 7. Legitimacy is not the same. Legitimacy is the domain that underpins the rest of the war. Because if we lose the legitimacy front, then our military advantages on all the other fronts really don't matter. If we emerge from this war a global pariah where the average European is convinced that Israel is worse than Nazi Germany. And that is the goal of the information war that is being waged against us right now. To convince the average person in the West that Israel is worse than Nazi Germany. Worse because the Nazis couldn't have known any better, and the Jews really should. The goal of calling us genocidal is to make killing us a moral act. Israel's enemies want to destroy Israel, and they believe it will be easier to destroy Israel if they convince the world that Israel deserves to be destroyed. That is the context in which we have to understand the propaganda war that is being waged against Israel. And I'll bring an example from just the last hour. While we were outside having our coffees, one of the UN's made-up commissions released its report concluding that Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza. In fact, whereas the Irish, God bless them, know that Israel cannot possibly be held guilty of genocide and therefore asked the court to redefine the legal rule that genocidal intent is not the only plausible intent, it is one possible intent. This report comes out and says genocidal intent is the only plausible explanation for Israel's actions in Gaza. As if we're fighting ghosts, as if there isn't a terrorist army that is trying to gain the protections of international law by violating the protections of international law, as if there are no hostages at all. The anti-Semite knows that you are not a thief. He wants to watch you turn out your pockets. That is why they invited you onto the debate in Copenhagen with Amnesty, because you get dragged onto their turf. And the debate about whether Israel is committing genocide, God forbid, is then a question about the methodological footnote at the bottom of page 49 rather than the substance, which is that there is a movement here that wants to destroy Israel and is trying to frame Israel as the enemy of humanity in order to legitimize its destruction, to legitimize violence against Israel, and to legitimize violence against Jews and Israelis around the world, which is the eighth front of this war. The murder of Yaron Leshinsky, Reichman graduate in Washington, D.C., that's the eighth front of this war. The National Security Council warning yesterday that Israelis should not go to Turkey over the holidays because it's a life-threatening risk, that's the eighth front of the war. It's a campaign that seeks to weaponize and mobilize international institutions in order to make Israel a global pariah and justify and promote violence against us, whether we are here, whether we are anywhere around the world, based on the argument that Israel has broken every norm and every rule of humanity. The problem is not that Israel is committing crimes, the problem is that Israel is a crime. It's not that Israel should be stopped, it's that Israel should be ended. They want violence against us and they want Western people to cheer along when that happens, saying they broke every rule in the book, they violated every norm of humanity, they're an illegitimate state, not a state committing illegitimate acts, an illegitimate state, and we owe them nothing. And that's why the fight against the lawfare waged against us is so critical and so important, because it is laying the foundations in people's minds for that argument that Israel itself is illegitimate and that it's Israel itself that needs to be dismantled. So more power to everyone fighting against the lawfare campaign. Thank you.
I do agree that there is no doubt that it is the eighth front of the war, and the implication will have a huge, the outcome of this eighth front will have a huge implication, from my point of view, for the future of the state of Israel. No doubt, even if we're talking from the legal point of view or from the legislation point of view. But because we're running out of time and we still have a few questions, and now they're going to be specific one, please try to squeeze your answer to 1 minute. I made a mistake with Greg, and then everyone took the time.
It's a big ask for lawyers.
Yeah, so please. So Daphne, let's have a dream that the war in Gaza ends tomorrow. I know it looks like it's going to stay with us forever, especially after the last 12 hours. But I do believe that one time it's going to end. What, in your point of view, will be the implication to the lawfare? What will be the implication to the ongoing cases against Israel in the ICC, ICJ, and other places.
I just want to follow up maybe on what Eylon said. It was, and some of my other colleagues here. I think it's clear that even though, or even if we live in a world where international law and international institutions are being abused, Israel still can't afford to ignore international law or ignore the legitimacy front and dismiss it. And I think this is where the danger lies, right? Oh, this is what they want. They don't care about actually genuinely criticizing or pointing out to some of the difficulties of waging a war, but they actually care about making Israel be an illegitimate thing altogether. And then it's easy to get to the point where you say, okay, so then what can we do about that? That's so extreme that let's go and dismiss it and not do anything about it. And I think this is really dangerous, right? Because we can't afford this. Israel can't afford it. And Greg, you pointed out to some of the implications. Israel is not an island. Israel is not the United States of America. Israel is a small country that needs alliances, that needs allies, that needs interceptor for its Iron Dome protection, that needs vetoes in the Security Council. So how do we make sure that this is preserved? So Israel needs to work harder than ever to make sure that despite all of this, this campaign against it, these things stay in place and are preserved. And so that's the real challenge. It's not about dismissing it, it's about working harder and maybe working differently, which is what I was trying to explain in the beginning. So what we see now is that we have a situation where Israel's brand, in my view, is damaged. And you're asking me, Shay, what happens now if the war ends? Is that going to make things better? And I think I'm not the bearer of very good news here. I don't think the cases at the International Court of Justice or at the ICC are going to be closed now because the war is over. On the contrary, usually accountability processes, they begin once the war ends. The wars end. And here, it started earlier, but it will definitely continue. Just like the scars of the battles of Khan Yunis are going to stay with us, the scars of the battles in The Hague are going to stay with us as well. And the cases are still ongoing. And Israeli soldiers are still going to be vulnerable to arrest in foreign countries. So no, it's not going to really stop here. And so that's why more evidence will be available. There will be an opportunity to visit Gaza, which so far has been claimed is not possible. And when we see more and more attempts at isolating Israel, like recently Spain said that Israel cannot participate in international sports competition, which is a very big step, and we need to keep an eye for that. So I don't see how stopping the war will bring us back, and unfortunately we will continue. This is something that Israel will have to continue to grapple with. After the Goldstone report in 2009, Israel created special units, I want to say, in the Ministry of Justice to deal with lawfare. And I think this was a major change from the point of view of how Israel is dealing with these challenges. And I think now is another critical moment for Israel to think about what kind of experts we need, how are we getting ready for the day that the ICJ perhaps finds Israel guilty of, I don't know, something related to genocide. I don't want to put words in the mouth of the court, God forbid. But I think that this is what we need to deal with, right? Multinational corporations deal with challenges and crises all the time. They have a group of experts whose job it is to minimize the impact of these crises in the court of public opinion. So I think that's a little bit of what we need to do. There needs to continue being a legal effort behind all of this, but as well as psychological operations expert, communications expert, and branding experts, like I said. And we need to work very hard to actually make sure that we do damage control with respect to the Israel brand, but also that we work very hard to fix it in the wake of the war. We have a lot of work ahead for sure.
Greg, I have another question for you, please, and we discuss it a little bit. In your mind, as you know, President Trump and the Trump administration has imposed sanctions on the ICC. Actually, what is the meaning of that? Are they undermining the legitimacy of the international legal institution? Do you think they will assist Israel in the campaign against the ICC? We know for Bolsonaro, it didn't help him. So, please.
Thank you. clearly the sanctions against the IC are intended to undermine its legitimacy, and they are, in fact, doing so to some extent. It needs to be borne in mind that the lawfare campaign against Israel began around the time of the creation of the ICC. You had the Durban Conference in 2001. The ICC was created under the Rome Statute in 1998, and it came into being in 2004. And we have seen in 2011 Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas declare a campaign of lawfare, that the Palestinian Authority would join international institutions and would prosecute its case in all of these fora. So the ICC is a primary vehicle for that purpose. When the ICC was created, a particular section, I think 8.2e, created, in fact, a new crime. It was meant to codify existing previous crimes, but it created a new crime of indirect transfer of one's own civilians into occupied territory so as to be able to criminalise Israeli policy. So the Trump administration put sanctions on the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda in 2020 in relation to her bringing the situation in Palestine case before the court. And then the Biden administration in April 2021 nullified that sanction. When the Trump administration came back into the White House this year in 2025, they nullified the Biden nullification and reintroduced a basis, which then resulted in February on sanctions against Karim Khan, in July against Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on rights of Palestinians in occupied territories, and then last month against 2 ICC judges and 2 deputy prosecutors. Now, Fatou Bensouda, her husband is an oil trader and magnate in West Africa who does deals. Her son was shot in Chicago. He was a drug trafficker. She was the advisor in Gambia to the dictator in Gambia at the time that Gambian citizens were incarcerated, tortured, and murdered. So clearly a person of high moral standing to lead the International Criminal Court. Karim Khan has currently been stood down, the prosecutor who succeeded after her, for rape of staff and also for improper consultation with judges in the ICC. So when we talk about delegitimization, we need to remember that this institution was created as a political institution. The prosecutors that have been appointed don't seem to have a huge amount of moral integrity. They're political operators. The 2 judges that have been sanctioned, one French, one Canadian for the case against the US in Afghanistan, and the other Nicolas Gouliou, the French judge for the case against Israel, I think deserve the sanctions. And in fact, this doesn't undermine legitimacy in international institutions. I'm going to have to cut myself short. But international law is a political construct. It has to be remembered that international law is the handmaiden of diplomacy. It crystallizes diplomatic outcomes into rules. And in the current environment, 194 members of the UN, 57 of them members of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which on its website specifies that it was created to put forward the case for Palestine and against Israel, with the support of a great many, and I regret to say, particularly Roman Catholic-dominated states, who seek to roll back the legitimacy of Israel as a state and its authority over holy sites of the other Abrahamic religions, are setting the political dialogue that is then crystallized into rules that work against Israel. So I think that the sanctions, in fact, don't actually undermine the legitimacy of international law, but shine a light upon illegitimate legitimacy of certain institutions, and the ICC is one of those institutions.
Natasha, a different question from a different angle. Next week, during the United Nations General Assembly, few leaders like President Macron and others are going to declare their support of a Palestinian state. What do you think might be the implication for the lawfare and the legislation campaign against the state of Israel?
Well, I'd actually just like to link it to Greg's answer just now, because he mentioned Mahmoud Abbas's declaration of lawfare, and I think it's time we start taking that declaration seriously. And this campaign for recognition of Palestinian statehood is part and parcel of what was set out in that, infamous article by Abbas in the New York Times. This is what it was all leading up to. But the impact of that is purely in the lawfare arena. It cannot change what fundamental international law says about statehood, which is customary international law, but also set out in the Montevideo Convention. What you need for a state at a minimum is a defined territory, which of course the Palestinians never had. And if you want to talk about real applicable international law, including the customary rule of uti possidetis iuris, to understand what the status of the territory is, then what this proposed recognition does is ultimately attack Israeli sovereign territory, which hasn't changed since 1948. We've had, of course, a series of political agreements that have said that the formation or amendment to borders is a final status negotiation issue. We haven't reached that point. So fundamentally, we're looking at the continued politicization of international law in this realm. Of course, that's going to have additional implications. But there's just one very short point I want to make in relation to distinguishing, I think, different realms that we've already had in the discussion, which is the very proper and appropriate nuanced debate and conversation that exists within Israel internally about how to approach very difficult questions, unprecedented military situations, and do so in compliance with international law. I have not seen anywhere comparable to those conversations and those debates at every level, through the Military Advocate General Court up to the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. That is not what is happening in the international arena. That is not what Israel's detractors are interested in. And the way that you can tell the difference, and this comes into this distinction between so-called anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which I fundamentally do not believe exists in the way that is being discussed frequently. The way you tell the difference is what is true and what is not. When people advance, as Pnina said, blood libels against the state of Israel, that is not legitimate criticism. That is not the subject for nuanced debate and conversation. That debate about the legal parameters and how one best complies with them is happening in Israel on a daily basis. And I've been into Gaza with military experts and lawyers that say that they have never seen the measures that Israel takes in that respect, not just to comply with international law, but to uphold standards that go far above that. So in that context, we need to separate out the nuanced, proper discussion within Israel internally and the falsehoods that are being projected in the international arena.
Thanks. Pnina, there was anything else that Israel could have done actually against the ICC, not against, but actually to prevent, for example, the warrant arrest against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Gallant, or actually to stop the process? What we should have done?
So again, I think, and I agree with my colleagues here, we are facing a campaign, an organized campaign against Israel, and it is a politicized campaign, and these bodies have a political element. Having said that, I think again, we cannot disregard Israel's responsibility, the role that Israel is playing also in making this campaign succeed against us. Because the way Israel is operating in this war, and I agree, these internal debates, they were in the past. The way Israel is operating in this war is actually helping the campaign against it. Okay, we are supplying constantly ammunition to our enemies in this campaign. And it starts with the actions themselves that I think are not taking into account enough considerations of legitimacy, of sometimes even legality, and it continues with the statements. it is so important to make statements of adherence to the law of war, of the importance of respecting our moral values, and not only that they're not said, they are opposite statements made constantly, and I'm not talking only immediately after the 7th of October, but till today, including all the time, about wiping out Gaza, no civilians in Gaza, tearing up buildings in Gaza to show something to someone, making people of Gaza leave Gaza, and other such statements. This is weapons in the campaign against us. Then what could be done and can help is investigations. And 2 more points and I'm ending. And there are not enough investigations. Investigations are important for complementarity, but they're also important for the next point. The 4th point is explaining what we do. There are no papers explaining our position, explaining the complexity. And lastly, it's, yes, ending the war, I think, has an impact on this campaign, but also in general, using diplomacy, and not only force, and more force, which doesn't help us, not, I think, on the ground, but for sure, not in the international arena.
Eylon, I know we're running out of time. Just, I need 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Quick, we have 2 seconds.
No. As a spokesperson, you will not squeeze your answer. A very simple one. Are we going to change the narrative?
You see, this is how the rules are rigged against us. Time is up. Look, the first decision is Israel has to decide that it wants to take the battle for legitimacy seriously, and we simply have not done that. The incredible gains that were made at the beginning of the war, when civilians stepped into the breach to fill the nation's comms efforts, unraveled. People who were in reserves went back to civilian life. Others weren't paid. Others were dismissed for untoward political reasons. And we hear the Prime Minister the other day saying, if I had to choose between victory and the propaganda against us and victory on the battlefield, then I choose victory on the battlefield. As if it's an either-or battle, and as if victory against the propaganda against us doesn't support victory on the battlefield. We had just the other day a report that despite the unprecedented amount of money given to the foreign ministry, our foreign embassies have now been instructed to freeze all public diplomacy activities that haven't been funded yet because the money might not actually come through. I'm sorry, this is not serious. That, together with remarks by various extremist ministers who seem determined to convince the world that the worst accusations against us are true, are not the actions of a government that is committed to fighting delegitimization against us. And I desperately hope that as a country we wake up and begin to fight back before the damage that's been done becomes too great to undo.
Thank you. So unfortunately, I don't have time to thank you, but thank you.